Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation Series. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. I am Ronald Spatz, Editor-in-Chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review, 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. Alaska Quarterly Review is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Today, we are featuring a poetry reading by poet George Bilgere. George is the author of 9 collections of poems: The Going, University of Missouri Press; Big Bong, Copper Beech Press; The Good Kiss, University of Akron Press; Haywire, University State University Press; The White Museum, Autumn House Press; Imperial, University of Pittsburgh Press; Blood Pages, Pittsburgh Press; Central Air, Pittsburgh Press; and most recently, Cheap Motels of My Youth, Rattle Poetry. George came into national prominence in 2002 when then U.S. Poet Laureate Billy Collins chose his collection of poems, The Good Kiss, to win the University of Akron Poetry Prize. Collins then named George to one of 2 Witter Bynner Fellows for 2002 and invited him to read at the Library of Congress. In 2006, Ed Field chose his book Haywire to win the prestigious May Swenson Poetry Award, and radio host Garrison Keillor began reading George's poems on his daily national radio program, Writer's Almanac. The popularity of George's poems on the show led to his appearance on Keillor's long-running NPR radio show, A Prairie Home Companion. George's many honors include the 2022 Reader's Choice Award for the Rattle magazine and the 2021 Editor's Choice Award for the New Ohio Review. He has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ohio Arts Council, the Pushcart Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, the Witter Bynner Foundation, through the Library of Congress. In addition to Alaska Quarterly Review, his poems have appeared in Poetry, Kenyon Review, Best American Poetry, New Ohio Review, Field, Georgia Review, Southern Review, Sewanee Review, Plowshares, and the New England Review. Of his poetry, Alicia Ostreicher said this: George Bilgere is an absolute whiz at the twists and turns of the glorious American language, the flexible American syntax as spoken by everyone up and down the great chain of Americanness in our bewitched century. Oh, what a pleasure to watch. It is my pleasure to welcome George. Over to you, George.
Ron, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. What a pleasure to be here. And I would like to thank the Alaska Quarterly Review and the Anchorage Museum for hosting me on the show, and for Ron Spatz for introducing me and putting this whole thing together. It's a delight to be part of your series, Ron. And I thought I would begin my reading tonight by reading the poem that I guess kind of brought me to Ron's attention and had brought me into the Alaska Quarterly Review. It was a poem I wrote a couple of years ago My wife and I were at a local cafe here in Cleveland, where I'm from, and it was a beautiful Saturday morning. And I was sitting there sipping my coffee, and this couple came in, and there was something about them. They were an older couple, really around my age. There was something about them that was so striking that I couldn't stop watching them. And I didn't really know what it was as I looked at them. But as listeners out there who are poets know, these things get into your mind, and you start working on them, and you realize, I've got to write about this. So I wrote a poem about this couple who showed up in the cafe that day, that beautiful summer day in Cleveland a couple of years ago. And the poem is called Arrival. I've seen that couple before, mid 70s, I'd say, trim and gray, arrived here from a good life. They give off that we know what we're doing vibe, that sense of a fine journey behind them, full of kids and grandkids, dinner parties on the patio, summers in the south of France, and some very skillful navigation through all kinds of weather that got them here safely. A little fly blown, it must be said, but that's the 70s for you. One day he said to her, "There's this nice little cafe. Good coffee. The toasted bagel with cream cheese is outstanding. It's about half a century from here. Why don't we go there together? And I'll read the Times, and you can kind of gaze off dreamily at the people passing by with your fabulous, dreamy gaze, now and then taking a sip of your cappuccino." "Okay," she said. And 50 years later, there they were, sitting next to us there. And I hope I'll see them this summer as well. I have a new book out. It's called Cheap Motels of My Youth. Um, and I thought I would begin the reading today by reading a few poems from this book. It's from Rattle Press. And the opening poem in the book is called Nine, as in age nine. I happen to be the world's oldest, relatively new dad. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old. And observing the 11-year-old when he was a couple of years ago, when he was 9, I mean, one of the reasons we have kids is to relive our own childhoods, right? I mean, the delight in watching them go through the same things that we went through allows us to be kids again for their whole childhood. So, watching Michael going about the business of being a 9-year-old inspired this memory of mine from being 9 years old, many, many years ago. It's called Nine. I'm standing by the pop machine at the gas station, drinking a root beer. It cost a dime, my whole allowance. My bike, a J.C. Higgins 3-speed, looks cool. I just washed it and waxed the blue fenders. Grown-ups are moving around me in kind of a fog. Actually, I feel sorry for grown-ups with their neckties, their dark jackets, and serious talk. I am wearing low-top Keds. Their shoes are hard and gigantic. Try climbing a tree in those shoes. How am I supposed to know that an old, white-haired guy, a grown-up, is watching me from his desk in the future, writing down every move I make? Why would anybody even do that? If there's one thing I don't like, it's writing. Writing and division. This root beer is actually excellent. It's a hot day. My fenders are waxed. And that was a glimpse into my mind when I was 9 years old. Um, Another poem from this collection. One of the pleasures of watching children is seeing their sense of time. They have a very different sense of time from the grown-up adult sense of time. Time is very flexible. It's very plastic. It barely exists in their minds. And this poem called Avocados, written a few years ago when my son Michael was 5. This poem speaks to that difference between grown-up time sense and kid time sense. It's called Avocados. My son comes into the kitchen and asks if he can have an avocado. Avocado, he says, loving the weight of each green syllable on his tongue. Avocados represent an immense step for him, an evolutionary leap far beyond the narrow confines of cornflakes wherein he has dwelt for so long. The breast, the cornflake, the avocado. Such has been his journey thus far. You'll have to wait until they're ripe, I tell him. You want some cornflakes instead? No thanks, he says, and wanders back into the world of being 5, while I'm doing the dishes at this point. I start thinking about ripening and how glad I am that it takes time, and his own ripening will be years in the making. Years, I say aloud, enjoying that long, luxurious syllable like a cat stretching out on my tongue. As Michael comes in again, it's been 5 minutes, and asks, "Are they ripe yet?" "No, not quite yet, honey. Want some cornflakes in the meantime?" "That's okay," he says. "I'll wait." um, he didn't wait. He had the cornflakes. Here's a poem also set in a cafe about this extraordinary thing that women do. And they do it so quietly. It happens right in front of us and we barely notice it. My wife did it. Every mom has done it. It is being pregnant, that extraordinary state of being. And I was at a cafe again a couple of years ago, and I was looking a couple of tables over at this young woman who was pregnant. And while being pregnant, she was doing other things. And the idea for this poem came to me, and it's called Multitasking. And this is for all pregnant women. The pregnant young woman at the next table is checking her phone while at the same time crafting a delicate little skull, a couple of eyes, and 2 beautifully sculpted ears, not to mention a spleen and a gallbladder. She's finished the tiny trip hammer heart going lickety split. So she texts her mom while focusing quite intensely on colon, rectum, etc. And the stomach is just about wrapped up, but there's still plenty of work to be done on the spine, all those little bones, and the central nervous system with its confounding spaghetti of wiring. And now she orders an espresso before getting back to the toes, the feet. Jesus, how many bones does it take to build somebody? But it's okay, no sweat. She's actually enjoying it. And now she texts her husband wine, Cheetos, pickles. Okay, she shouldn't be drinking, but it's just one glass at dinner. And all I've done at my table is read the obits while she's already finishing up the brain, which is always a challenge. That's hard. How do they do it? We males look on in wonder and awe and disbelief. The final poem in this collection is it's for my mother and father, and the poem deals with kind of an obsession of mine as a writer, and I think probably most poets, just that ongoing mystery I talked about before with avocados, that mystery of time, how time past and time present in some ways seem to coexist side by side, almost in the same moment. Um, I never get over that. I think probably half of my poems deal with that in one way or another. So here's a poem for my parents, Mike and Ruth, called Salad. It is a summer evening in 1948. My mother and father are in the backyard of the little duplex they've rented. Summer evening in St. Louis. I have yet to exist, but nonetheless, I know that two hamburgers are on the grill and the beer is cold in the humid dusk. A dog barks next door. My father turns the burgers. My mother goes in to set the table for two and make a salad. There's more beer in the fridge. They don't even have a TV. Nobody does. In the kitchen that does not include me, the burgers are great, and my father says something that makes my mother laugh so hard that I can hear her in my backyard tonight in Cleveland, where, thanks to them, I exist at the grill, a beer in my hand, a dog barking, my wife in the kitchen making a salad. And we are, as I'm making this recording, we are facing some incredibly bad winter weather here in the Midwest. As I just said, I'm in Cleveland. All over this region, the weather in the following few days is going to dip below zero. So I thought I'm going to read a poem I have about that. About a time it was zero here in Cleveland some years back. It's from a book called The White Museum. The poem is called Zero. And I grew up in Southern California, and I'm still not used to this. Zero. First, it was 5 above, then 2, then one morning, just plain zero. There was a strange thrill in saying it. It's zero, I said, when you got up. I was pouring your coffee, and suddenly the whole house made sense. The roof, the walls, the little heat registers rattling on the floor, even the mortgage. Zero, you said, still in your robe. And you walked to the window and looked out at the blanket of snow on the garden where last summer you planted carrots and radishes, sweet peas and onions, and a tiny rainforest of tomatoes in the hot delirium of June. Yes, I said, with a certain grim finality, staring at the white cap of snow on the barbecue grill I'd neglected to put in the garage for winter. And the radio says it could go lower. I like that robe. It's white and shimmery, and it has a habit of falling open unless you tie it just right. This wasn't the barbarians at the gate. It wasn't Carthage in flames, or even the Donner Party, but it was zero, by God, and the robe fell open. Oh, and it's coming, so be ready. Another poem from the same collection that I think about often when I think about my father is a poem called "Taking Out the Trash," which many of us are tasked with doing every week. I just did it a couple of days ago. Taking out the trash, and this poem is for my father. I remember as a child watching my father take out the trash at the frozen crack of dawn, cursing as he dragged the stinking cans to the curb and thinking, that's not something I am ever going to do. In other ways, I was a model son, standing at the mirror as he shaved, dabbing the warm cream on my cheek, dreaming of a razor and whiskers of my very own. Watching him light up as he read the Sunday paper, one eye squinted against smoke and bad news, had me reading the funnies before I could even read. My eye squinted against nothing. And the deft, one-handed way he straightened his fedora's brim, while at the same time adjusting the coordinates of rake and tilt, makes me regret that the hat, like my father, has vanished, along with the strop and razor and lathery bowl of curds. Even smoking and the Sunday paper are on their way out. These are the losses I'm mourning this morning as I drag the stinking trash cans to the curb. So I vowed never to do it, but it happened to me, as it does with everyone. um, Here's a poem from a book of mine called Central Air about something I read in the newspaper a few years ago. It's called Polar Bear. A father died heroically in some Alaskan park, trying to save his kids from a polar bear. Long ago, when his mother gave birth one afternoon in Barstow, California, could anyone have prophesied, as in an old myth, that the baby crying at her breast would one day be killed and partially eaten by a polar bear? Has anyone from Barstow, California been killed and partially eaten by a polar bear? Yet her son was. He looked up from making camp, pitching the tent or lighting his Coleman stove, and there it was, white and immense, his fate. And he died heroically and was partially eaten. Of course, the bear had to be killed. The rangers shot it, which makes sense. You can't have polar bears running around in the wilderness. The wilderness is a place for dads and kids and Coleman stoves. Polar bears just, well, they just kind of ruin the whole thing. As for the bear, it didn't die heroically. It just got shot and fell over and was sent to a lab for testing. And here's a poem for my mom, for my mother, who my father died when I was 10, and my mother became a single mom and did an incredible job of raising three kids and feeding us and clothing us and getting us ready to face life. And she worked as a nurse. And I remember she my mother was a voracious reader. She grew up in a little farm in Illinois, and from an early age, I think she sought a larger world beyond the farm through reading. And I think she exhausted the resources of the tiny little library in the town she grew up in Carmi, Illinois. And that reading habit never left her. And I remember watching her sitting in the den of our tiny little house in California, reading these great classic novels. Well, one of the novels she read, I had not read ever for my entire life until just a few years ago. Anna Karenina. I had never read Anna Karenina. And I got it out of the library and I was reading it, and I realized I had this strange feeling as I moved through the novel, through the streets of the novel, meeting the characters of the novel, sitting in the great rooms and houses and parlors of the novel, I realized my mom has been here. She has gone through this too. And it was almost as if I thought I might encounter her in one of these parties, in one of these gatherings, in this novel, that what she had experienced, I was now experiencing. So this poem is for her, Anna Karenina. My mother was long dead before I was old enough to ask her who she was. But I'm reading Anna Karenina, which I recall her burning through late nights after a double shift, after the insertion of suppositories and the emptying of bedpans, after she fried us up some pork chops and opened a can of applesauce and a can of hominy and a can of fruit cocktail. She'd sit down with her cigarettes and red wine and read these big novels that took her away from thinking all day about money and into whatever Emma Bovary or Eleanor Dashwood was dealing with. She disappeared into French winters. She walked down London streets or sat quietly with Anna in her parlor. I look around in the novel for her cigarettes tonight, her glass of wine, anything she might have left behind. I'm pausing while the whole room roars with applause. Can you hear me now? Here's a poem for my son, Alex. Um, when your kid gets that first scar, after that first visit to the emergency room, you see your child, the center of your universe, cut, wounded, and bleeding. You never get over that. And so Alex got a scar one day at the pool, got a cut, and this poem commemorates that scar, which in a sense, as scars do, lives on. The scar. My son slipped on the ladder to the pool and smacked his head. Blood calling on his small shoulders, the doctor stitching him whole. 3 years on, after a haircut, the scar still rises. A quarter moon a woman will ask about as they lie there one night, her fingers in his hair, her voice in his ear, the secret delight of him, a bit like burnt toast in her nostrils as she takes his strangeness into her. What she won't know is how that frail, delicate skull I held that day in my hands resounded on the hot concrete. It echoed all summer, less like an egg cracking in a bowl or a world breaking than the wild beating of love against my heart. Dear girl who will one day win him, that part of the boy is mine. Yeah, something you will never forget. Um, this poem is for my father, who died of alcoholism when he was very young. He was only 45. Um, Things went wrong with his life in mysterious ways that perhaps I will never understand, and perhaps he never understood. But it led with him uh, dead of drinking, dead of cirrhosis. And his last years struggling with the bottle were really terrible for his wife to watch, my mother, and for us kids to watch. And there were some really appalling moments that happened. And this is one of them. Um, the poem is called The Forge. I remember watching my father stop halfway up the driveway because my tricycle was blocking the way to the garage, and how he solved the problem by picking up the tricycle by the handlebars and smashing it through the windshield of our brand new family station wagon, his face red with scotch, his black tie and jacket flapping with effort, the tricycle making its way a little farther with each blow into the roomy interior of the latest model as the safety glass relented, the tricycle and the windshield both praiseworthy for their toughness, the struggle between them somehow making perfect sense in midday on our quiet suburban street. The windshield, the anvil, the trike, the hammer, the marriage, the forge, and failure glowing in the heat, beaten and tempered, slowly taking shape. Um, on a lighter note, here's a poem for, for my kids who occasionally have asked me this question. I think all kids ask their parents this question. How did you meet mom? Okay. How did you meet her mother? Well, here's a poem from Central Air called How I Met Your Mother. I saw her at a party. I walked up and said, how would you feel about getting married, buying a house, enduring the agony of childbirth a couple of times, watching a lot of Netflix together, dining out? I'm thinking specifically of the Osobuco at Rigeri's, getting a dog, negotiating mortgages, and finally sitting by me in those last days, arranging the funeral, tidying up, then starting your strange new life, the one without me. How does that sound? And she sipped her mojito and said, what are we waiting for? And we didn't wait. I'm just going to read a couple of more poems for you uh, this evening. And this is another poem. Um, this is a poem. Here is another poem. This is a poem from my wife, mother of my children. And this, if you have ever had had the good fortune Men out there, dads, if you have had the good fortune to watch your wife give birth, you know it is easily the most extraordinary moment of your life. No question about it. Nothing is more astonishing than seeing that happen. But it's not necessarily the case for everyone else in that delivery room. And that's what this poem is about. What you think is the central chief miracle of the world ain't necessarily the central chief miracle of the world to all those people standing around you in that delivery room. So here's the poem. It's called Push. And this is about the birth of my son, Alex. Push. I'm trying to look as if I'm suffering. I have this anguished expression on my face, but it's wasted since I'm wearing a surgical mask. And anyway, the focus here is really on my wife, and the doctor is right there between her legs, and he's shouting, "Push!" And my wife is doing this astounding thing. She's pushing yet another human being into the world, a world that so far seems to be pushing back. And the baby's heartbeat is down to 90. And so the doc says, I think maybe one more try, then we do the cesarean. So things in the room really are a bit tense. It's definitely a moment that demands a lot of attention. And my wife is gathering whatever shreds of strength remain in the shaking, exhausted sleeve of flesh her body has become, the blood and sweat and fluids everywhere. And this is it. When I hear the attending nurse standing just behind me saying to this guy in scrubs standing next to her, I think he's the anesthesiologist's assistant, she says, well, just because Karen says she has a boyfriend doesn't necessarily mean she won't go out with you. And the guy says, his voice rising because my wife really is screaming quite loudly at this point. He says, yeah, okay, I guess I should give it a try. I mean, what's the worst that can happen other than getting shot down and looking like a total fool? And the nurse says, as the doctor is shouting, push! Yeah, but hasn't it been like a long dry spell for you? Aren't you getting a little desperate here? And the guy laughs, and my wife screams again, and the doctor says, yes! And into the world comes the bloody head, followed by the naked, lovely, bloody little boy, insanely ill prepared for any of this. And I guess the guy actually is going to ask Karen out. And I say, go for it. Yes, that's really how it happened. Oh my God, incredible. I'm going to close things down with a final poem, and this is for my mother, and it's called, and again, in gratitude to her for all she did for us kids. The poem is called Schwinn, as in Schwinn bicycle. It's a short poem. One day, my mother astonished me by getting astride my bike, the heavy old balloon tired Schwinn I used for my afternoon paper route, and pedaling away on it down the street. Skirt flying, hair blown back, a girl again in the wind and speed that had nothing to do with pulling double shifts at the hospital or cooking meatloaf or sewing up my jeans. The old bike carrying her away from my father dead of booze and her own nightly bottle of red wine in front of the news. She flew down the road so far I could barely see her, then slowly pedaled back to me and stepped off the bike, my mom again. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to be with you for this reading. Thank you again, Ron Spatz and Alaska Quarterly Review, and I wish you good evening.